I hope that there is more burning questions from the audience to the panel. Yes?
Hi, my name is Diana Msea. I'm a lawyer working for the university. I'm sitting with research and innovation contracts. So I practically look at the successful trials, those who are successful with their projects to get money for their research. And after listening to so many interesting ideas, and also like looking back at private experiences, my father who benefited from sort of an innovative treatment. I'm actually wondering, is there such a significant body of doctors waiting to jump at the opportunity of experimenting on patients? I mean, I'm a lawyer, and I am, it's as a lawyer, it's quite exciting to see your work as a regulation, like your ideas put on paper, creating a nice framework for people to do research. But at the same time, when you create so many hurdles for patients to go through, do they really benefit in the end? I mean, in the last presentation, we've seen a beautiful list with ideas about how to protect patients who would be undergoing these treatments with unproven methods. But was that list, how does that list relate to your own experience when you received that innovative treatment? What would have happened if you would have had to go through those? I mean, have you gone through those that many steps? So, should we look at a critical mass of these tests, let's say, or educated medical tests? Is there a real benefit of creating such a heavy regulatory framework?
Well, I can start. Are you suggesting that these requirements are way too high? That is unrealistic, or is that?
I'm wondering. I'm actually asking you how, as a patient, as a patient, the one that would have had to go through those steps in order to receive the treatment. What would that, how would that have impacted your experience as a patient?
In my case, that was a research project. It had been ethically reviewed already. It was just that they hadn't found more than 2 patients before. So in that situation, I wasn't a doctor, I was a patient. And I didn't care less, do whatever. That was my feeling, do whatever. I want to live more than 3 months. But I have to rely that there are protection for me in that situation, that others have thought about the risks. Because I cannot judge in that situation clearly, even though I'm a physician.
Thank you so much, Diana, for your question. I think that we're talking about so many different situations of experimentation. I mean, what you experienced, first of all, it was in a research setting, but if it hadn't been, it was like the last resort. But you sometimes see, for instance, in Danish law, is that the doctors who apply alternative methods to the treatment of their patients were not in this kind of situation. They had some allergic reactions, so it could be rheumatological conditions. Doctors would like to implant, small pieces of gold in their knees to see if it helps them. We have had these cases that have actually also been assessed by institutional reports. So these are sort of different situations. And in these situations, I think that clearly such guidelines could actually be very helpful, because we sort of give doctors some kind of directions. I mean, doctors who want to use these alternative methods and give patients some kind of direction. What should they observe in terms of informed patient probably in advance, and the reporting effect, where you would actually avoid this kind of practices. Because normally they are not disciplined because the disciplinary board finds that it is not being harmful. So you see, it's not beneficial, but it's not harmful either. So it's more boiling down to whether the patients were properly informed about that this was a new treatment and where you do not have scientific evidence of it. So I think in some situations it could be good to have these guidelines. But as I understood your question, it's more about whether it really matters to have sophisticated guidelines for situations which only occurs very rarely, exceptional. And it's hard to legislate for exceptional situations. I think it's other than you can use them.
Yes. So I hand over here.
Yeah, I'm thinking maybe one of the main points of having this kind of regulation is that we really want to have a system where we learn from all cases. And I think if you have a system where it's very much up to the individual doctor to take steps when they run out of standard options, then it will most likely not be adequately documented. So I think that would be one of the main points. We shouldn't do new things without learning from it.
Yes.
I guess we've been asking about regulation and whether regulation is needed. But of course, we need to think of regulation as something homogeneous. Regulation can be lots of things. It can be very bureaucratic. It can be proportionate. If we think of regulation as a form of control, it can be control about lots of different things. So it could be a control that controls what you get to do, where you have to seek prospective permission, which might be appropriate for some risk assessment. It might be control over what's reported, and for some things that might be what's needed. So I guess when we ask the question, is regulation needed, we should also be thinking what regulation we're talking about. Some regulation, of course, is going to be needed, but it has to be proportionate, and it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all question. Different regulations, different kinds of activities would be appropriate.
Okay, and Lena, you had a comment also?
Yeah, I hope it was a comment related to this, but I think that regulation and perhaps especially external assessment is very important here, since there is always a potential conflict of interest. The interest in curing the patient as compared to the interest in getting new knowledge. And I think that external assessments are important both for the doctor's sake, if the doctor is uncertain, could I do this or not, to make sure that the doctor is not unnecessarily cautious, but also for the patient's sake, to make sure that the patient isn't used just to get new knowledge. And in Sweden, when we make the distinction between research and healthcare, it is often made based on whether there is an intention to publish the results. If there is an intention to publish the results, then it qualifies as research. And that triggers the external assessment. If it's an intention to make it public, then it's also very clear in the something. Yes. I saw you were.
Yeah, well, that's a way too wide definition of research, because there's a whole lot of things published in scientific journals. There are case reports and literature, the editor, and whatever. So you cannot say that if it's published in this and that journal, that is research.
No, but
that doesn't work.
Of course, I mean, first of all, the requirements in the legislation have to be met, that you're doing, personal data and so on. But then, to know whether it is research or whether it is just healthcare, you have the intention to publish the research. And that is quite good, and that the research team has worked with. But anyway, what I would like to say about this is that I think that it's quite wise and quite good. Because if you have that intention, then you have that secondary interest, which might conflict your treatment interest. And then it's really to have an external assessment.
Okay.
So, Mats Johansson, Lund University, thanks for interesting presentations. I have a question concerning the role of oversight. So if we have this kind of regulation, then what is the role of oversight? And someone mentioned meaningful oversight, and I wonder what is that? What level of oversight should we aim for?
So, who said it?
Didn't mean too much, but except that it has to be functional oversight that does it is more than just ticking boxes and good paperwork. What exactly more it is, I don't know. It's maybe how ethics competition ideal the function, the do it purpose.
Well, I'm interested in, because the Swedish Ethical Review Authority has it's their task to do oversight with respect to the Ethical Review Act in Sweden, and they have done almost nothing for over 10 years. So I think it's an important question. If this regulation is important, then we need some kind of oversight, and then we must have some idea of what this oversight should be about. Yeah.
And also resources to make the oversight, because it doesn't really have any impact if you're just reporting all kinds of incidents and nobody looks into it. So this is really, it's really damaging to the system.
So there's one issue that I haven't heard a lot of discussion about. Tell me if I've missed it. But one thing we haven't spent a lot of time talking about are the resource demands for providing innovative therapy. And I'm thinking of two different resource demands. So one of them is the question of whether healthcare systems can provide the resources. I know you mentioned, I think, in one of the two cases you presented, Catherine, that there was crowdsourcing. So in some cases, maybe there's resources that are being provided by other actors. But even in those cases, the physicians who are providing those services, even if they're being paid by private sources or out of pocket, are still physicians who have probably accrued years and years of public investment in their training. And so that cost is often not sort of internalized into the cost of physicians providing services. And I know, in the case of NHS, there's stories about how, the scarcity in that system, and, I'm sure in every national healthcare system there are challenges with being able to provide just basic services to validated treatments. And so I guess I'm sort of wondering, maybe this question is, I guess, for Catherine and Ingemar. I'm probably the best ones to answer this. The extent to which the oversight process, is intended to incorporate not merely considerations about the risk-benefit and scientific justification for the patient in this setting, but also the extent to which issues about resource demands for a public healthcare system ought to be incorporated into these decisions as well. Do you understand the question? Okay.
So we had some discussion of that of our recent project, and it was raised by a lot of clinicians that we talked to at the kind of event in the room.
Please louder or closer to the
It was raised by quite a lot of the clinicians that we talked to during our project as being the elephant in the room. That's the limited resources. And looking at it from a UK context, I think the fact that we have a national health service creates a culture which makes perhaps some of the cases that we have had specific to our culture. So there's that point, which I think if those cases had come up, perhaps in North America, they would have had a different outcome. So I understand that in North America, where there's an insurance system, the wishes of the parents are given much more weight. Perhaps all sort of
United States.
Okay. United States, sorry. The wishes of the parents are given much more weight, more than the customer basis. in the national publicly funded healthcare system, we were told repeatedly we need to talk about this, but no one wants to talk about it. So we have included some recommendations that we need to talk about it because providing ventilation, ongoing life support for babies is extremely expensive, and that's a horrible fact because no parent wants to provide an hospital because we can't afford to keep your child alive. So we think that's the machine. It's a conversation that nobody wants to have, and certainly not about a specific patient. But perhaps on a kind of system level, a resource allocation level, we can talk about it in a way that we could perhaps be a bit more comfortable with, thinking about how best can we use these resources, how can resources come into decisions. So, for example, any decisions made about care of a child should be fair in that it's based on a national policy, not just based on regional policy. In this hospital, we do this, in another hospital, we don't do that. So that's actually in professional guidance that should be based on national policy, but I've not come across any national policy. I don't know if that's a good answer, but it's a question that we have also recommended or something.
Yes, please.
I think it's a really interesting question, and it's a question that you can look at separately from innovation. In the context of innovation, I guess there's other goods that come from innovation that go beyond innovation, the immediate patient benefit, or not. And I guess a good example may be something like uterus transplant, which is done in Saudi first, and then in Sweden, successful pregnancy that followed. It was a very innovative new procedure, incredibly costly, required an awful lot of investment to actually benefit relatively few people, and the opportunity cost is actually quite significant. But as the surgeon doing the UK trial on it has talked about, and I'm not verified, but I think it's an interesting angle, has talked about the added value of this research in understanding the vascular system around the organ, which has helped with bleeding during pregnancy and so on. So the innovation itself, we often focus on the opportunity cost of the innovation itself. It's possible as also, it could be just a benefit, a scientific benefit from experimenting and looking, and there's because of human conditioning, hoping to stick and see what happens. That's how we get lots of goods and gains. The important point about regulation is it has to be done in a way that protects safety. It doesn't mean but there are benefits that might warrant public investment that might go beyond immediate patient.
I just wanted to come back to this question of informed consent, because I thought what was interesting about these presentations, as great as they were, is that it seemed to be a very peripheral discussion we've been having today. And I think that if you look at, for example, the Myndigheten för vård och analys in Sweden did this report in 2017 on informed consent, and the data is actually quite frightening. For standard healthcare, it actually says that about half of patients in Sweden that were studied, and this may not be representative, but if it's representative, it's frightening, that half were not told the treatment alternatives or the risks and benefits of different alternatives. And if that is true, if that is representative of what's happening in Sweden, that is a serious pattern of informed consent violations and therefore human rights violations. And if we think about that in regular practice and what happens when you're talking about experimental treatment or unproven methods, where research could even be included, then you're talking about violations of non-derogable human rights. And that is experimentation without free and full informed consent. I guess my question to you is should this not be a bigger part of our discussion? When we talk about unproven methods, we talk about how complicated it is for parents of children, for example. Do they understand the risks when they're consenting to things for their children? Do children's own interests matter? Because international guidelines say if you can't prove there's a benefit for a child who can't consent, you should not be doing that as research. I mean, there are specific human rights issues that are at stake, and I just question whether or not we should be making this a more central part of this discussion.
Who wants to comment on that? Yes. No, I agree with you. But I think that what we have been talking about is what is acceptable even if you have consent. And then you can add the consent dimension to it. But I do agree with you. Yeah, but we already knew that. Yeah.
I guess there was a question over, I mean, obviously the concept of informed consent has become quite idealised, and you can look critically at the concept of fully informed consent and argue it might not ever be really possible. I guess maybe we should be thinking about what is good enough in the consent for the procedure.
Well, I guess if I
what
could
is being sufficiently informed.
Well, but I think there is, like I say, I think there's at least a threshold that's been set up by, I think, the Committee on Human Rights, the Commission for the Human Rights of Biomedicine, the explanatory report gives certain fundamentals that have to be disclosed. There have to be, the same is true for the special rapporteur for this right to health. There are certain criteria that say what is the bottom line, that there has to be a threshold of disclosing risks and benefits and trying to make sure the patient understands. Even the evidence-based medicine scholars have talked about this, understanding the values of the patient. It may be relevant to what you're disclosing to them, to use research on patient values to determine what they are concerned about, not just recommending a treatment that has certain side effects, but being more sensitive to the side effects that different patient populations might be concerned about. There's a lot of research on this being done in the medical literature and in the human rights literature that I just don't think it's not being incorporated into this discussion of unproven methods. And I think this gets back to Leanna's point. If you have a threshold first that says what should you not do, this can reduce the burdens of informed consent because it means that you have a standard or threshold for when you use unproven methods that reduce the risks. If there's no floor, if there's no, saying this we will not go below this floor, then a wide array of risks and uncertainties could be exposed to patients, which makes informed consent more complicated. It makes patients' rights at risk. These are the kind of things we have to talk about. I think it's not just a question of questioning informed consent. There are certain thresholds that are established well in human rights literature as well as in ethical guidelines, it seems to me.
Could I just, in the context of parents making decisions for their children, just to sort of justify why I didn't mention the word consent very much, is because in the cases that we were looking at, often the parents I was viewed as being the innovators, asking the doctors to take forward an idea that they had. So that switches everything round, and so that more sort of traditional idea of doctors wanting to try something or do something and asking a patient or parents to sign up to that just didn't seem to be relevant in the situations that we had come across. So that's my reason really for not using that word so much, and I'm more focusing on this sort of shared decision making, where both parties have a responsibility, both the healthcare team and the parents, to listen to each other. And from the part of healthcare team, yes, of course, that includes being clear about what is, treatment option or care option involved in terms of risk and uncertainty, based on their medical expertise. But on the other hand, the expertise and role of the parents being considered as well as part of a joint decision about whether to go ahead with something.
Yeah, maybe I could add to this discussion that I'm sure that we had survey demonstrating that at least the TPs were not really familiar with the Buddhist regulation on informed consent, which is quite specific in a famous context. Maybe it's better today, I don't know. But what we know is that in a research setting, the researchers of course have to provide a written consent form so that we can scrutinize it and see that they are actually informing patients or research participants about the possible risks and side effects, etc., etc. And our general impression is based on the work of research committee I know is that they're generally quite good in terms of informing about both that there are these and that risk, and also the risk that people don't know about, and we can't promise that it will have effect on you, etc. So it's quite reasonable. The problem, the big problem with these research forms is that they are simply too long. It's like 13 pages, very detailed information about what is actually going on. And it's even hard for the specialists to understand them when we, and also of course for ordinary lay persons to understand them. So it's good that we have them anyhow, irrespective of whether patients understand them or not, because there's also an all information and it forces the researchers to think it through, which is not always done in clinical practice where things are moving fast, etc., etc. But whether they really serve the purpose of having the enlightened patient making a rational decision, I doubt. Yeah.
Okay. There seems to be no more questions. And then I think you got the concluding remark. Mette. And thank you to the speakers for this very interesting afternoon. So, shall I give them a hand? And I will then leave over the microphone to Arnason from Iceland to come up with the concluding remarks. And Arnason wasn't really obliged to be here because his term in the Nordic Bio Committee ended by the end of 2018. But since he had been pivotal in arranging this meeting, he decided to come anyway, and I think we should thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks so much, Kirsten. Yeah, I wouldn't have missed it for the world. It's been a truly inspiring day. Great to have all of you reflecting into again. So I will not offer much in terms of a synthesis, but I'll just touch on a few notes. And so we learned a lot about clinical innovation and definitions of innovation, and we spanned quite a number of things. And I would like to see we started out talking about drugs, but we also learned about surgery, and the medical field is really quite vast. We could have covered other topics, and so from a personal note, I was just so actually happened to be staying with my father and stepmom at the Lyngby, and my stepmom, she's sort of a head nurse at the Premier ward at Rikshospitalet, and that's critically ill individuals arriving very early in life, and she was telling me that they actually have been reading up on very recent research papers, mainly from North America, where there are high-level university hospitals developing new ways of helping children, not just put them in a box and insulate them. So and they applied a lot of them, really quite fast, and they've done their own, effectively trials, just testing out things, and made great strides. And curiously, when they look at what, how these methods have transferred across the globe, then they haven't, gone that far. So I think there's clearly a gap in how much of the findings are translating into clinics or wards or treatments, and even in North America. And maybe it's just because the university hospitals are the elite, locations, and the others cannot afford anything. But there's still a lot of stuff that can be done in transferring the knowledge and applying it, and that comes down to MDs and nurses and practitioners. But it's very interesting to see, when you contrast what Jonathan talked about in the morning, drug development frameworks, very structured, in very good protocols, and everything step by step and for a reason, because if you read Bad Pharma or White Hat, White Coat, Black Hat, there's a lot of issues that were with the drug industry for a while. You know, most of them hopefully have been sorted, but there's also this bias of, you know, publishing the positive result, publishing the surrogates, not the final outcomes and all of these things. And, but it's also interesting to see heavily regulated, but then there are other aspects of medicine that are a lot less regulated. Something is driven by companies, others are driven by clinicians, you know, in the hospitals, just taking, you know, case by case, you know, decisions or making small trials. Maybe they need to be, the trials need to be bigger or synchronized, and that's sort of what Steinar has been working on, as we didn't actually hear much about, but it's quite an interesting angle. And I found it truly inspiring to hear, you know, your experiences, Anna-Sophie, about, you know, how you could perceive what the hospitals and the staff was telling you and what they should have been telling you. And the theme came up again about communication. You know, that's clearly something that we need to work on. And clearly I'm not good at it, so somebody else has to solve that problem. But where's the last note here? This here. But I also agree with Kirsten. So it was curious. We have had many meetings, you know, in the 6 years I've been in the committee, but we have never had that many suggestions for improvements, and that's, you know, truly fantastic. And there's clearly room for, you know, pushing that further. Maybe take this topic up again in a different format, and then just pull the parliamentarians or the people from ministries in here, and, you know, not quite shove it down their throats, but at least introduce the topics, and, you know, see where that leads, so we can, you know, advance things on that front as well. And so since it's my last, you know, duty for the committee, I'll allow myself to take a little sort of detour on the topic. So we happen to be here on Íslandsbryggja on Njálsgata 76, and some of you will recognize that this is a character from one of the Icelandic sagas, and so it's quite an interesting character from a very interesting story, actually. They were, you know, very innovative characters in that story. They did a lot of attempts to maximize harm to their you know, opponents. You know, even they were putting their families at risk, and, you know, the death rate was terrible. But it's quite entertaining, you know, almost like Scandinavian, you know, nowadays. But Njál, he was not the Viking type. He was actually, you know, smart, as opposed to most of the others. And he, you know, knew the law, and he was, you know, he could, you know, try to, like, settle affairs and make, you know, reconciliations with, you know, other factions. You know. And he didn't get much for it at the end. He got burned with his family and his house. But you know, that's part of, you know, it's literature, so it has to be some dramatic. But yeah, so there's not really a connection I could make with Njál and the conference, but I still had to, you know, bring it up anyway. But yeah, so before I conclude, I would like to thank all the committee members, you know, who helped me throughout the years, in particular this organizing committee. So Susanna, Kirsten, and Ingemar, and then, you know, in particular Mette for helping us organize and, you know, providing the local arrangements, NCC, everybody. They've done a marvelous job. So I just want to mention at the end, and then of course that, you know, of course. At the end, the next meeting of the committee will be in the Faroe Islands. So it's going to be on ethics, health, and research in small-scale communities. That's 12th of September, isn't it? Yeah. So, you know, book your tickets. It's going to be fabulous. So, with many thanks